Hi, everyone who's joining us. Right now, I'm just going to allow one more minute for everyone who registered to join us, and I'll be starting the panel right then.
Sorry, phone. Do we see the name of participants, or
yes,
it just shows us as a number?
Yeah. If you click on that number,
I see. Yeah, perfect. Yes,
you'll see the list. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Okay. I'll be starting in just 1 minute. Well, that's great. I'm going to get started now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. And welcome to Alibaba Conundrums panel discussion featuring the keynote of Dr. Zainub Verjee, a presentation by Mohammad Salemy, and the artist talk of the Alibaba Conundrum duo, that is Ali Ahadi and Babak Golkar. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Zainub Verjee, and I'm the Public Programs and Residency Coordinator here at Griffin Art Projects. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, as well as the Stolo nations, to whom we are deeply grateful. As well, we would like to thank Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, North Vancouver Recreation and Culture, and the Friday Foundation for their continuing support of our public programs. If you would like to see live captions displays for today's presentation, you can enable this by selecting the CC live translation button at the bottom of your screen. Please note that not all names will be accurate, but we hope that they can capture most of the conversation. At a later date, we will be uploading this conversation to our digital archive, where you can find this conversation as well as all of our other past programs. I will post a link on the chat in a second for you. And another thing is that if you're experiencing any technical issues with the Zoom interface, please know that we will be sharing this live stream on Facebook as well. I'm going to drop the Facebook link to Griffin, where you can check us out. And if you want, you can give us a follow. So there you go. You have now the digital archive link and the Facebook link for your convenience. And lastly, I'll just mention that there will be a Q&A part of this discussion at the end. So if at any point throughout this presentations you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A dialog box, which is located right below your Zoom window, and I'll be reading them aloud. Just a note that, as you know, this conversation is being recorded. So if you choose to raise your hand for me to unmute yourself and to pose that question live, just know that your voice will be recorded as well. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Zainub Verjee. So Dr. Zainub, born in Kenya and educated in the UK, arrived in Canada in the early 1970s and studied business administration and economics at Simon Fraser University. She's a programmer and curator, critic, writer, and arts administrator. Embedded in a Fluxus ethos in her practice as a multidisciplinary artist, she uses language, labor, video, sound, textile, and food as her materiality. Deeply engaged with the UK's British Black arts, third cinema, and the post-Bengal decolonization and the history of women's labor in British Columbia, Zainub co-founded the critically acclaimed Invisible Colors, an international film video festival and symposium for third world women and women of color in 1989, and later led the Western Front as the executive director through the 90s. She then moved to Ontario to work with the Canada Council for the Arts Policy Branch at the Department of the Canadian Heritage, and later as the inaugural director of the Culture Division at the City of Mississauga. Her artworks have been shown at the Venice Biennale, Museum of Modern Art in New York, Portland Institute of Contemporary Art in Portland in the US, Asian Triennial Manchester, the Centre d'Art Contemporain de Besse Normandie in France, Museo de Arte Carrillo Gil in Mexico City, Art Gallery of Alberta, Embassy Cultural House in London, Ontario, and resides in private and public collections in the Vancouver Art Gallery, Maurice and Helen Belkin Art Gallery, as well as others. So please, Dr. Verjee, please join us. I will start sharing your screen.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And I just, from wherever you are, I know that some people are in Europe, like Mohammed, and maybe others are zooming in from other places. Thank you to Ali Ahadi and Babak Golkar for inviting me to speak at this panel. And I also want to thank the team at Griffin Art Project. I do want to acknowledge Narendra Pachkera's critical help in reflecting and responding to my ideas that I will share with you today. Well, I could not say no to this invitation. This is one of the more intellectually stimulating shows that offers humor, irony, doubt, fiction, reality, and political economy as multiple modalities to question our being. The central motive that binds them in this inquiry is language and its politics, as well as our future. Language remains an important everyday material for me to reflect and engage with as an artist. This was alluded to in our prior conversations as Ali and Babak underlined the kinship in intellectual inquiry that we all four here share. Thus, I think we can say Alibaba is at once all about epistemic hosting. Today in this talk, I am culling from disparate sources, as this is a work in progress, and I want to touch upon different nodes of ideas to bring together an argument that is evolving. The crisis in our politics is a crisis of language, and I will refer to a range of works and will quote them and will refer to them in depth and in detail in an upcoming text. In other words, though not in a prescriptive sense of the term, this talk will look at how the crisis of language makes democracy precarious and accentuates fragility of the human condition. I will briefly speak and or allude to imagination, language, logic, acceleration, consciousness, and finally, the state of politics and its inherent crisis. So let's begin to interrogate the claims of this epistemic hosting. Next slide. Here, I find the work of Miranda Fricker's landmark book, Epistemic Injustice, as a critical point of entry. It is about how individuals and groups can be wronged in the connections of belief, knowledge, and testimony. It helps to situate it within the broader ethical and epistemological and political frameworks. According to Fricker, epistemic injustice is, quote, distinctively epistemic kind of injustice in which someone is wronged, specifically in their capacity as a knower. Fricker argues that there are two distinct forms of epistemic injustice, namely testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. A testimonial injustice occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word, as in the case where the police do not believe someone because he is Black or they are Black. And hermeneutical injustice, by contrast, occurs when a gap in a collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. As Christy Dodson cautions us, quote, epistemic exclusions afforded positions and communities that produced deficiencies in social knowledge. An epistemic exclusion in this analysis is an infringement on the epistemic agency of knowers that reduces her or his ability to participate in a given epistemic community. Epistemic agency will concern the ability to utilize persuasively shared epistemic resources within a given epistemic community in order to participate in edge production and, if required, the revision of those same resources. A compromise to epistemic agency when unwarranted damages not only individual knowers, but also the state of social knowledge and shared epistemic resources, unquote. The operative term of epistemic injustice enables us to understand the making of the episteme as a cognitive sanctuary in the public imagination. And to quote Miranda, stereotypes and the practices they engender, implying epistemic injustice, are no one's and everyone's within a social imagination where members of a society readily grant them cognitive sanctuary, to borrow Fricke's apt phrase, unquote. Here, the capacity to imagine becomes a critical point that dovetails well into the other element, social imaginary. Thus, central to our enterprise today is how to rethink reason, truth, doing, thought, and being. The answers are pegged on our capacity to imagine. Given the epistemic injustice, are we allowed to imagine? And can we build our capacities to imagine? And do we have sites for imagination? Now, the answers to these questions hinge on the primacy of language. Hold that thought. Next slide, please. Now, this is an image that Hank Bull shared on one of his visits to Toronto a few years ago, and it is a telling image. I've walked past this place many times and smiled. Recently, the Indian linguist and critic G.N. Davy wrote, "The Western system thinks of knowledge as known, as logos. In contrast, Indian traditions of thought, theistic as well as atheistic, look at knowledge as an experience, as knowing, a verb, an internalized acquisition, or to use a Greek term, as gnosis. One tradition privileges thought or rationality, and the other prioritizes intuition or the inner ability to perceive. One admits proof and evidence. The other rests upon testimony and the truth of the word. One attempts to develop methods of bringing perception into the form of a logical statement or theory, while the other intensifies the organic link between a pre-existing ocean of wisdom and the consciousness that aspires to open up to it. In simple words, the two are different as material, as cultural deposits, and as descriptions of the reality surrounding us. They may intersect, but can hardly fit together in any single arrangement of educating the next generation," unquote. I will pick on the inner ability to perceive a little later in this talk. Also, one can see how this resonates with the idea of epistemic injustice that I just talked about. And Devi continues, quote, "The evolution of knowledge traditions now perceived all over the world in the singular as Western knowledge is a complex story. This has involved many substreams drawn from many civilizations in ancient times and many continents in modern times, but all woven together into a rationality-based matrix of knowledge developed in modern Europe. The complexity is so much that it would be impossible to trace all of the origins of that knowledge system. Yet at the heart of the entire process was a conception of knowledge as an intellectual outcome, a body of verifiable abstraction unquote. Let's move on to another aspect. Next slide. The modern understanding of the imagination as authentically creative is one of the preconditions for contemporary elucidations of social imaginaries. How do we understand the link between imagination and the imaginary? Kathleen Lennon explores the link between imagination, regarded as the faculty of creating images of forms, and the imaginary, which links such imagery with affect or emotion and captures the significance which the world carries for us. There are some fundamental questions, such as whether there is a distinction between the perceived and the imagined, the relationship between imagination and creativity, and the role of the body in perception and imagination. While in my inquiry, I'm drawn more by the role of the imaginary, I'm drawn more by the role the imaginary plays in the formation of the self and the social world. And I've drawn heavily upon certain writers, and principally the work of Cornelius Castoriadis, Paul Ricoeur, and the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. And I'll speak to the work of Taylor a little later. Castoriadis uses the concept of the imaginary to describe how societies tend to construct mythologies around social orders and means of production. The imaginary is essentially social and transcends individual subjective representation. It is a cultural ethos. It is a domain of signification that emerges ex nihilo out of history and does not refer to anything particular or immediate. Rather, it produces significations that organize human behavior and reinforce social relations. Cornelius offers an interesting way out, quote, "Rather than searching for an absolute truth, we are, when thinking, engaging in human creation in order to be able to encounter the real. When entering the metaphorical labyrinth to explore the real, we simultaneously create new interconnecting corridors to negotiate," end quote. He adds, "This is our life world, the social and historical world, as it is given in our experience and understanding, whose reality we come to know only in fragments as we articulate and problematize it and debate its meaning. This requires what he thought or called thoughtful doing, on which the further development of our social, cultural, and historical world depends." Historical time, often spoken in terms of dates and years, reorient one's memories and transforms the ordinary unfolding of time into sites of inquiry. A certain horizon of time often frames a regime of history. And here I'd like to invoke the work of the Cambridge historian Christopher Clark, Time and Power. He argues that time is a political strategy and political ideas inscribe the historical register. Different regimes of power will build their own narratives. It implies that every generation produces its own pathologies to excavate the underlying structures of power and to shape its subsequent manifestation. Giving it a form to accentuate its reality. This is Alibaba Conundrum. And with these thoughts as a preface, I'm sharing with all of you today, one of my new works. Next. And I think this sums up well as to what we're exploring here. I'm a product of your language. How do others imagine me? How do I imagine others? What language defines me? Can I engage with my reality with the language of my choice? How does language make me invisible? Does it make me an accelerationist? Let me share another work. Next. This is about the relationship between language and reality, often spoken in terms of linguistic determinism. It opens up challenges about our ability to see if we do not have a language. In other words, do we see what we know, or conversely, can we see what we don't know? This straddles the two dominant claims, one made in clinical psychology by the Stroop test, and two made by the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in linguistics. The Stroop test is our tendency to experience difficulty naming a physical color when it is used to spell the name of a different color, while this Whorfian thesis hinges on the idea that differences between the structures of different languages shape how their speakers perceive and conceptualize the world. In other words, how words change our world. Of course, I'm not going to speak now of the deep fake, but one can see the drift of thought and an argument about the interplay between language and reality. Wittgenstein in 1915 said, quote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." If he was right, then language is not so much a device for recording and communicating information as the framework of all our knowledge and experience. As Jonathan Rice says, quote, "But the philosophers who drew inspiration from Wittgenstein's remark could not agree about what it implied. The positivists among them thought of language as a strict map of impersonal facts, dismissing everything else as rhetoric, emotion, or superstition. The humanists, on the other hand, saw it as a creative force that gives wings to our perception and opens us to the unknown. For the positivists, you might say, language aspires to the condition of natural science, but for the humanists, it is essentially a poem." At this juncture, let me bring in Charles Taylor. Now, Taylor stresses that language is both descriptive and expressive. The ways in which humans use language point to our myriad affiliations as well as to new directions. Primarily in this book, he introduces two competing views of language. Quote, "The designative or end-framing tradition is promoted by Hobbes, Locke, and Condillac. Throughout the book, Taylor refers to this trio as the HLC, while he names HHH theories after Hamann, Herder, and Humboldt. And Taylor's project is basically to champion the former theories against the latter. That is, the designative and constitutive views explains that what distinguishes these two types of theory is, above all, that HLC theories are inframing theories that understand language within the framework of a picture of human life, behavior, purposes, or mental functioning, which is itself described and defined without reference to language. Whereas the HHH theories see language as constitutive, that is, as marking possible new purposes, new levels of behavior, and new meanings. Given this body of work, if one is familiar with it, it comes as no surprise that Taylor is an advocate of the second mode and what he refers to as constitutive. As an advocate of holistic view of language, for Taylor, language is not simply goal-oriented, nor can it be regimented, because the humans are both in and of the world. Our use of language connects us to different ways of articulating reality. If you think you see what you think you see, then let us turn the tables and pose the question, what don't you see? Next. This image gives it away, and I'm here talking about how the idea of redaction functions as a thought control technique. And I'll just take a minute to speak to this artwork, Redacted Artist Labor, and it's based on the role of redaction in creating meaning for texts in various formats. This artwork also plays on the tension between visibility and invisibility and the relationship between labor and language. Given its power in creating meaning and non-meaning, redaction itself becomes an aesthetic statement of power to erase, censor, render invisible by the very power bestowed by the state and or its agencies. It alludes to redaction criticism, often used in the study of theological literature and based on vocabulary, comparison and repetition. Redaction is mainstream and very much part of the political toolkit as much as statecraft. This artwork is a continuation of my practice where language becomes the materiality of the form and its meaning. It represents my sustained and long-term engagement with the issues of artists' labor and the instrument of the status of the artist and the language used to create the visibility and invisibility of labor. And we saw that during the underlying conditions becoming the relieving leitmotif in a pandemic, the state of labor or artist labor stood exposed yet invisible in the pandemic. Now let's look at another aspect. Do social inequalities have epistemic effects? Next. I want to look at the normative issues of justice, liberty, equality, and argue that the inherent crisis therein is essentially that of a linguistic one. How can we make connections and conflations between logic and language in terms of the modality of thinking and its performative elements? Something that is central for me here is the idea of negation and how the contemporary notions of speech acts, political correctness, or even wokeness stems from a certain degree of confusion between thought and language. When we look at a logical form and logical equivalence, the content of a statement is not the same as the logical form. Is peace an absence of war? Does execution of law result in justice? Does a good life for all connote socialism? Logical analysis does not help determine the merit of an argument. Instead, it helps to analyze the argument's form to determine if the truth of the conclusion follows from the truth of the preceding statements. Another way to look at this relationship is when one is acquitted in a court of law, while the public opinion holds the individual guilty. This is where language and logic collide. Now, on the left-hand side, you see this image. It's an artwork of Narendra Pachkar's, and Narendra posits, who is a Muslim, as the central contemporary philosophical problem of the 21st century. He engages through a complex set of arguments to locate its genealogy in continental Europe, and it is premised on the play of language. He picks up from Primo Levi, who is a Muslim. It is a question raised in a footnote in a chapter, if this is a man, in Primo Levi's The Drowned and the Saved, an autobiographical account of his time in Auschwitz. Next. The German sociologist and critical theorist Hartmut Rosa points to the paradox that despite all our time-saving technologies, people hardly have the feeling that they have plenty of time. Furthermore, there seems to be an increasing asynchronicity between the various social domains. The relatively slow-working world of politics can hardly keep pace with the world of finance. Rosa dissects modernity as a process of acceleration comprising the three dimensions of technical acceleration, acceleration of social change, and acceleration of the pace of life. Although his analysis is largely in line with Paul Virilio's dromology and David Harvey's analysis of modernity as time-space compression, the underlying question and concern of Rosa is somewhat different. While Virilio seems to aim mainly at a cultural critique and Harvey at an analysis of capitalism as a system, Rosa is first and foremost interested in the question of the good life. Speed per se is not the problem. He says, in my main book on social acceleration, I first of all wanted to identify the change in temporal structure that accompanied modernity. There wasn't really a systematic account of it. What I wanted to do was to analyze what is accelerating and what is not, and what may be the consequences of it. And looking into these consequences, I was not optimistic about them. Nevertheless, I did not say that speed per se is bad, and I didn't say that showness is good, and certainly not the latter. I do share with the accelerationists the idea that just being nostalgic about the past would be a mistake, because this leads you to very quickly to the idea that the past was much better, and that, of course, is not the case. Today, you sometimes find a nostalgia for the Fordist period, 40s to the 70s, while this period was, of course, the most alienated age ever. And Rosa says, in my book, indeed, speed is not per se bad, but it is bad when it leads to alienation. So the question for me would be, what do accelerationists do with this? When today you talk with young people about the future, it is very interesting that they think of it in technological terms, artificial intelligence, what will become possible to do, and so on. That has changed a lot in comparison to the 70s or 80s, when young people thought about the future in more political terms. Let's shape the future politically. So there's been a division in how we think about novelty, with a still unbroken belief. And this is not only a belief, but also a fact in the expansion of our technological capacities. All our capacities, all our energies, all our dreams are fitted into the logic of increasing productivity. What has been lost, however, is the promise it carried, namely that through these innovations in science and technology, life would become better. No one believes the other way around, unquote. Stephen Shaviro alludes to this by referring to life under the accelerated capitalist mode of production as only a promise of happiness rather than happiness itself. EDI is a ready-made, as you see on the slide. This work refers to the accelerationist aesthetics, where everything is appropriated and turned into sources of surplus value. As Shaviro argues, and quote, this means labor, subjectivity, and social life are no longer outside capital and antagonistic to it. Rather, they are immediately produced as part of it. They cannot resist the depredations of capital because they themselves already are functions of capital. Neoliberalism is not just the ideology or belief system of this form of capitalism. It is also, more importantly, the concrete way in which the system works, end quote. So in our pursuit of happiness, all forms of resistance collapse and are co-opted by capital. This is because it is now understood that any accelerationism is not going to make capitalism fall apart. What this implies is that there's a shift from accelerationism as a political strategy, as we saw in the 60s and 70s, to accelerationism as an aesthetic that serves the subsumption. And as Rosa writes, the powers of acceleration no longer are experienced as a liberating force, but as an actually enslaving pressure instead. And that's the loop reality we live in. We're trapped. Next. So here I want to put across the point about the tension between rationality and emotions, feelings, gestures. So please pause now for a moment and notice, what are you feeling now? Or perhaps you simply have a sense that you exist. I like to quote, "Hunger and thirst, pain, pleasure, and distress, along with the unadorned but relentless feelings of existence, are all examples of homeostatic feelings. It is argued that homeostatic feelings are the source of consciousness. In a new theory of embodied consciousness, the neuroscientists Antonio Damasio and Hannah Damasio propose that feelings are the source of consciousness. Long dismissed as a secondary to reason, feelings are where consciousness begins. Without them, consciousness is impossible. They argue with radical implications for the hard problem of consciousness and the future of AI," unquote. Here I'm thinking of art and its relationship to the sacred, art and consciousness, for instance, the pioneering work of Roy Ascott. Neuroscientist Damasio is the author of Feeling and Knowing and the seminal book Descartes' Era. Towards a new theory of embodied consciousness, the primary argument that they offer is that consciousness begins with feeling and not thinking. And accordingly, they propose, quote, that consciousness is the result of the continued presence of homeostatic feelings. We continuously experience feelings of one kind or another, and feelings naturally tell each of us automatically not only that we exist, but that we exist in a physical body, vulnerable to discomfort, yet open to countless pleasures as well, unquote. There's another element that is connected to this, that of memory. On August 20th, 2020, as part of my aphorism series, I wrote in a public posting on a social media platform, quote, "Radical discourse is caught between amnesia and neologism." And I'll leave this at that. The next slide. In conclusion, to bring all of these disparate strands together, what we're looking at is the impact of language on norm-making relationships and producing subjectivity. Quote, "Language quietly conditions everyday experience in the way that it surreptitiously shapes individual subjects and citizens by posing as the norm. How different ways of seeing and processes of creating and presenting subjectivities are produced through media and via cybernetics under the hegemony of the English language. How socioeconomic structures reproduce themselves through image-based platforms, and how their production of subjectivities adhere to modes of late capitalism within contemporary life," unquote. And now let's go to the next slide. I think, therefore, I speak. I'm going to leave it here. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to hearing the rest of our speakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Verjee, for the keynote. And now I have the pleasure to introduce the artists that do Alibaba Conundrum. I'm going to start with Ali. So Ali Ahadi, born in Tehran in 1984, is a Vancouver-based artist and a scholar in humanities. His interdisciplinary practice spans from site-specific ephemeral installations to sculpture, photo, and video-based works, writing, and translation. Ahadi's work is constituted through addressing the problems of presentation and representation, monstration and demonstration, and the relationships between aesthetics and contingent forms of abstractions. His proposed protocol of abstraction calls for what he terms a monster, an assemblage of a disorganized relations between the linguistic economy and the optical economy of an object. Ahadi is an internationally exhibited artist. His last solo exhibition, Shid Jazz Academy, Go Ballet Academy, was held at the Art Gallery in Tehran. He holds a PhD in interdisciplinary studies with a focus on continental philosophy from the University of British Columbia. He currently teaches in the UB UBC's Department of Art History, Visual Art and Theory, where he previously received his MFA in Visual Arts in 2012. Ahadi's doctoral research devises two new models for a critical approach to historical and contemporary issues in art, politics, and philosophy. These models are thought activism and the visitor. Now, for Babak Golkar, born in 1976 in Berkeley, is an artist working and living in Vancouver, grounded in deconstruction, reapplication, and transformation. Golkar's working process is manifested in an array of media and object forms. His research emerges from his interest in the relationship between space and human conditions in the contemporary world, and aims to both examine and open established ways of looking. By distorting the assumed certainties of perspective, Golkar questions accepted cultural and socioeconomic systems and ideological viewpoints, as well as their persistence over time. He holds a BFA in Visual Arts from Henry Carter Institute and an MFA from the University of British Columbia. Golkar has exhibited and presented works in national and international institutions, including the Vancouver Art Gallery here in Vancouver, Polygon Gallery, West Vancouver Museum, Aga Khan Museum, Toronto, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal, the Sabrina Army Gallery, Madrid, Museum Bille Stock in Munich, Frame and Frame in Amsterdam, Sosdanag in Turin, Sharha Contemporary Art Museum in Sharha, Foundation Bourgogne Olympienne in Brussels, Institut de Montcarrat in Paris, and the Victorian Albert Museum in London. In 2022, Golkar was named the first International Jamil Fellow at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, UK, where he has been conducting research on the museum's collection. So Ali and Babak co-founded the duo Alibaba Conundrum in 2021, and now we have them in exhibition here at Griffin. And to hear more from them, I please invite you folks to start your presentation.
Thank you, Colin.
Are you seeing the presentation full screen?
Yes, I am.
Perfect.
Right. We'd like to begin by expressing our thanks to our keynote speaker, Dr. Verjee, our panelist, Mohammad Salemy, and our host, Griffin Art Projects, and its staff who've been working with us for the past couple of years. Alibaba Conundrum was formed to formalize a decade-long friendship that was packed with discursive argumentations and discussions around art and life. In a sense, we began this project years ago and grounded it in theories that Ali was working on through his scholarly research. What resulted from our ongoing discursive conversations was what can be formulated as practice, theory, practice, meaning that we began with practice, which were our discursive argumentations, and literally theorized them and arrived at practice again. What will follow is a schema towards a forthcoming publication, which will include our keynotes paper, as well as our panelist presentation. In addition to today's panel, our publication, which is set to be finalized shortly, will close the loop of our formula, again, practice, theory, practice. Today, we will present a formal paper titled, "I think, therefore I am," said Descartes. Replied the monster, "I think I am anyway. What do you think of my being?" This paper consists of two significant aspects. One, the theory of sensory alibi, first published in an interview I conducted with Ali, titled "Art, Sensory Alibi, or a Discursive Argumentation," in which we unpacked Ali's theory of the visitor, as well as the protocol of abstraction. This was published by Cocoon in 2021. The second key is that for us, Alibaba Conundrum, the project, operated as a manifestation of the theory of the visitor and its protocol of abstraction, and through discursive practice grounded in those two theories. Thus, our paper will focus on the discursive world of our project rather than the individual works in the exhibition. With that, I will pass the torch to Ali to present our paper.
I think, therefore I am, said Descartes. Replied the monster, I think I am anyway. What do you think of my being? Contemporary democratic materialism, postmodernism, along with its romantic formalism in art, politics, and culture. Today, it is very difficult to close one's eyes on the fact that both the discursive and the practical domains of art, which claim to have been pursuing the question of subjects encountering one another, have simply reached a theoretical impasse. The symptoms of such impasse can be roughly sketched out as the takeover of postmodernism along with its romantic formalism in art, politics, and culture, fascination. The takeover of postmodernism along with its romantic formalism in art, politics, and culture, fascination with the legalized particularities in the forms of identity politics and identitarian art practices, obsession with new materialism and object agency, object-oriented ontology, eradications of politics in the name of political correctness, infatuation with hyper-moralization of typical thinking exerted by cybernetic linguistic automatism vis-a-vis critical thinking, finding consolation in artistic productions that fall under the postmodern otherizing expressions of self, body, desire, sexual, and cultural differences at the expense of elimination of the ethics of the same, substituting people with doxa through the media's enforcement of an infantilizing language, and many more are instances of such an impasse. The French philosopher, in contrast with what can be called materialist dialectic, names the status of such a contemporary situation democratic materialism, whose axiom reads, there are only bodies and languages. Thus, the individual as fashioned by the contemporary world recognizes the objective existence of bodies alone. The equation of such a vision is that existence equals individual equals body. The axiom of materialist dialectic, however, is that there are only bodies and languages, except that there are truths. This syntax of except that is literally the subject, which has been altogether elided in the pantheon of post-structuralism/postmodernism. Since the subject is that of truth, the crucial consequence is that the syntactical induction of the subject cannot be marked with the pronouns I, we, they, etc., but would except that and aside from. Therefore, the subject cannot be reducible to a body and thus represented in the political discourse of particularities that identity politic is. The malady of contemporary arts, democratic materialism, in tandem with its postmodern structure, lies in the fact that in their subject always remains captured as a form of object, a particularity. What must be remembered, however, is at the end of the at the end of the day, a subject worthy of the name can never be an object, nor can it ever be a particularity. In contrast with formalism, that is mere operating on forms, the subject must be conceived of as a system of formalizations, itself as operation. Operation with respect to a certain logic. The body, or the object if you like, is what materially supports these formalizing operations in the world. That is precisely why the only empirical and objective content of the subject is metaphorical. Therefore, the body that bears the subject is indeed a metaphor for the subject that is essentially an index that must be constructed within a field of thought. Hence, the subject is a form of thought that is only constituted through a process which is transversal to the totality of available knowledge, particularities, or linguistic predications. The subject, as Lacan says, puts a hole in knowledge. Contemporary materialism is democratic because it supposedly recognizes the equality of all particularities in the world, plurality of languages, and equality of their juridical rights. All the while, we simply know that from the point of view of this world, from the perspective of the logic or transcendental of this world, and its dissemination of the language of tolerance, all particularities are not equal. There are good particularities and bad particularities. There is English as the hegemonic language and peripheral languages. There is terrorism, why not, as a particularity, and the war on terror as another particularity. There are civil prisoners and jihadi detainees, etc., without their plurality and diversity presupposing the equality of their juridical rights whatsoever. In short, What is at work with democratic materialism is the reduction of multiplicity into duality, that is, into the religious duality of good and evil. The simplest fact that divulges how empty such formalism is that any particularity that does not recognize the universal juridical and normative equality of all other particularities of all other languages does not deserve to be treated as equal with others. What is at the stake then is simple totalitarianism advertised as democracy, neoliberal culture advertised as multiculturalism, corporate individual cannibalism advertised as collective progress, mass-produced subjectivities advertised as singular subjects, and so on. At its core, democratic materialism is one language, one particularity that regulates and governs all the other bodies and languages. The dominant forms of contemporary art practices are indeed the fulfillment of the romantic formalism or postmodern paradigm of art, a paradigm in which art has on the one hand dispensed with the discursive argumentation, the idea of the universal and its attendant inhuman truth of art, and on the other hand remains absolutely obsessed with the humanistic and neoliberal instances of particularism. Postmodernism and the sensory alibi. As thoroughly discussed in the interview, Art, Sensory Alibi, or Discursive Argumentation, by constantly resorting to what I named the sensory alibi, art cannot escape the importance of argumentation as the core drive behind the expansion of its paradigm, both ontologically and historically. The sensory alibi, as another symptom of contemporary art's impasse, must be understood as a predominant prioritization of the individual's pseudo-poetic contemplative vision in art. This is typically manifested today in the supremacy of artistic practices and discussions whose general axiom is, art is not to make one think, rather to make one sense. Such an axiom is categorically inconsistent. On the one hand, it takes art as an a priori category, and thereby fails to understand it is a paradigmatic phenomenon. On the other hand, and at best, it is representative of the obsolete debate of sense experience of the world vis-a-vis the hermeneutical vision. In other words, it claims that sensory perception precedes all argumentative interpretation. What this vision epically fails to grasp is that it identifies sense experience with meaningful experience. If we take constructions of meaning as integrations of things, signs, senses, etc., into a whole, into a structure, therefore we can simply see that to explain our senses to ourselves, or even to explain why I sense the way I sense, we're immediately in the sphere of discursive and historical argumentation. In one word, the world is given to us already interpreted in language, and that's where the problem resides. The sensory alibi is therefore a symptom of contemporary art's inability to connect its sensorial mechanism to the historical and geopolitical processes as the cause behind the history of art's forms and senses. The sensory alibi emerges from a situation where art is not a modality of thinking and argumentation. Rather, it is simply a domain of ahistoricity, an obsession with body, identity, culture, and other forms of particularity. From the moment that the word became flesh, and flesh became the representation of Christ in the catacomb of Rome, the Western paradigm of art is still the paradigm of God and his godly word, language. In other words, from the 15th of August, the day of the Assumption of the Immaculate Virgin, impregnated by the word, all the way to the advent of conceptual art, the history of Western art is to be understood as the history of the message from the master who baits language. As Dominique Laporte says in his book entitled The History of Shed, language speaks and asks, why am I beautiful? Because my master baits me. The entire history of the development of Western art has been the history of preservation of the divine word concealed in images and objects. It has been the case all the way from the commissioning of religious paintings by the church to our contemporary proliferations of different forms of visual arts. Persistent throughout this history is the presence of a historical absence that is the word of God. It makes no difference that contemporary art is not about the divinity, but about the expression of sex, body, desire, and identity. Insofar as the paradigm of art is that of the audience and its identification of a meaning embedded in the art object, we are within a particularly Christian paradigm. The only difference is that God has been replaced by the artist and his word by the artist's intention, the meaning. This paradigm is all the more religious because akin to the idea of God as the representative of the infinite behind a fixated super object, the world, here too, the audience remains unchanged as it is not allowed to affect the language of art and the artist by its presence. All the audience is sanctioned to do is to discover the voice of the artist materialized as the meaning embedded in an object. This is the malady of audience or spectator. For the sake of clarity, it must also be noted that the paradigm of the so-called Eastern art is not that different either. The only difference there, let's take Islamic architecture, calligraphy, ceramic, etc., for instance, is that both the artist and the audience are theologically disciplined to understand that they are incapable of capturing the uncapturable word of God. All they must do is instead to take into heart the presence of the God that is in movement, that is Ibn Arabi's new Platonic unity in multiplicity and multiplicity in unity. In one word, in the East, the divine is not the word, because in the Eastern beginning, there was no word, nor was there a flesh, but only God's presence, for which the word is only a medium. For an encountering relationship with the world, we need a secular paradigm of art in which art attendant is not designated to meet the artist by the intermediary of the art object. Secularizing art means rendering both the artist and the art attendant critical and creative visitors of the contingencies of their own material and linguistic activities. Thus, visitor is an attempt for secularizing the paradigm of contemporary arts. To surmount the formal stagnation of contemporary art, we are in need of theories that distinguish between the so-called artistic subjectivity and the subject of art. Hence, the theory of the visitor. Since the real may only occur through the contest with the symbolic, that is to say, by challenging the operations of the transcendental or the logic of the world and its language, hence, the visitor is a thought activist attempting to counter-symbolize the language of art and typical thinking. Therefore, the crucial task of the visitor is to constantly ask, what is it that art ought to be? How can art cease being a particular equivalent, sensoriality, and become a generic equivalent, discursive and argumentative? What ought to be the contemporary artistic strategy, and what protocol of abstraction as methodology does such a strategy demand? The visitor is a reconfiguration of the categories of a spectator and of audience into the encountering subject position. By employing certain linguistic protocols, such as being open to the linguistic contingencies and the ecology of mistranslations, intentionally using signs in seemingly irrelevant semantic fields, disrupting the representational structure of the artistic world by resorting to the effects of neologisms and paralogisms, the visitor is a figure who creates new semiotic opportunities by constantly interrupting the established chain of signification. By introducing manipulative assertions and paradoxes into the material and intellectual organization of their practice. To be a visitor is a subject position that both the artist and art attendee can achieve to occupy. This way, and with the visitor, the old and Christian tripartite of art, that is, artist, art, spectator, is rendered obsolete and replaced with that of visitor, object, visitor. Visiting in this sense can be thought of as that which formalizes the effects of the body in accordance with certain logic. We have to remember that in contrast with an individual being or an object of art, a body is always already a composite being in a world. Logic and appearance are one and the same thing. To visit is to formalize linguistic thought acts that can bring about the change of the hegemonic grammar of the world, to employ particular language uses that could help transform a subjugating exteriority into a subjectivizing one. If we take subject as that which formalizes in a situation the passage from a being nothing into an existence that is thinkable, to visit is therefore to employ a protocol of abstraction as a means of subjectivization. The neologism visitability signifies a protocol of abstraction as well as a possible attribute of a work of art, an artistic situation, which provides the art attendee with a chance to become a visitor. To thought activistically abstract oneself from the reign of doxa is the only way of making thought possible. However, the word abstraction is completely saturated today. It is everywhere in contemporary art, in every gallery, in every biennale and art fair, to the extent that it basically no longer signifies anything, just an empty brand for the romantic formalism of contemporary democratic art. So to abstract the word from the reign of doxa, every contemporary art worthy of the name must have a protocol of abstraction and its own methodology that serves a greater strategy. A protocol that critically responds to the questions, what kind of abstraction? Abstraction from what? And why abstraction? Visitorability regards abstraction as an imperative protocol and a methodology, or rather as an artistic ethic for contemporary arts. The main question is, how can art propose a paradoxical account of abstraction in a democratic materialist world where there are only bodies and languages, and where, by way of mediatized and commodified languages, every different form of subjectivity are produced to govern these bodies and languages? Abstraction can only be that which imposes paradoxes upon the dominant language of the world, and on that of the art world in particular. In other words, abstraction, instead of merely being the absence of common name, must be thought of as the disorganization between the optical economy of the visible and self-evident object on the one hand, and the linguistic economy of the sable, visible language around the object, discourse, on the other hand. To put it differently, we are thinking of titles or linguistic economies, if you like, whose juxtaposition with the self-evident object disorganizes everything that the optical economy of the object had seemingly intended to work on, and the other way around. Visitorability is well aware that seeing, as in the words of Garrett James, is nothing other than saying or being told. Therefore, problematizing the relationship between the sensible and the semiotic, between vision and language, is the visitor's symbolic intervention into the imaginary and ideological world of art and politics. This way, art can increase the contingency of the real. Therefore, the question of artistic abstraction cannot be reduced to the trivial question of whether the sensible and self-evident object is visually recognizable or nameable. It may be or may not. In either case, the question of visual unrecognizability is not a sufficient criterion for abstraction to take place. The question is how art, as a form of thought, can facilitate the emergence of the unrecognizable, not in the materiality, but by its mediation. It can do so by disorganizing and disrupting all knowledge that exists around the way to recognizable objects that are just before our eyes. In an art world where unrecognizability of the art object is itself the most recognizable form of practice, the only way of abstraction worthy of the name is to manage an incommensurability between the object and the linguistic sign. In short, visitorability requires a triangulation between the object, the visitor, and language, insofar as the relations between the two opposing ends, that is the object and language, is incommensurable. Such triangulation is the ethical and the most imperative artistic tactique for surpassing the impasse of contemporary art and politics. The triangle of visitorability is the sole means for proving the importance of art today. Art is a modality which, by surmounting the dominance of the sensory alibi, could make thinking possible. Once again, for a work of art to be visitorable, for its nature to lend itself to the procedures of being visited, it must succeed in drawing this triangle of abstraction. Visitorable works or situations are constructed by the elements, sign objects, that appear as fully recognizable items in their individuality. Despite such recognizability in isolation, the way these elements are formalized and grouped together interrupts the established signification of each of those individual elements. In other words, the abstraction in visitorable works stems not from the appearance of an altogether unknown entity, but rather from the paradoxes that ensue from the placement of recognizable signs in an unknown chain of relations with other signs. This unknown chain, and not the individual links, is the main mode of signification of visitorable works or situation. To get this a bit clearer, we can take the constitution of a poetic sentence as an instance. What is at work in the poetic sentence is indeed the configurations of words, univocal symbols, whose way of being with one another, that is the formalization of a sentence, is causing a break in the sentence's chain of signification. Nevertheless, for a sentence to maintain its univocal meaning, it is necessary for its chain of significations to remain consistent and devoid of rupture. Therefore, what is at the stake with poetic sentences is the withering away of the univocity of meaning that typically shows itself in the paradoxical assembly of individual signs and words in favor of the emergence of the equivocity of the meaning. Poetic here must be perceived only in the context of the philosophical trajectory through which it has been developed. Poetics from the Greek poesis, meaning to make, poesis as opposed to mimesis, which concerns the representations of reality, is a form of creating or the act of making something which did not exist before. That is, to bring into being that which is not. Poesis, albeit prior to its Platonic differentiations, also has a corresponding signification with the term techne, know-how, and techniques, meaning how to originate or formalize something. On the basis of this context, the triangle of visitorability is a poetic constitution and protocol of abstraction. When a work or situation possesses a poetic triangulation, it is in fact a visitorable work or situation. A visitorable work or a situation is always reconstructible. The quality of being together of its constitutive elements is such that it forces upon the figure who is attending it the emergence of a subject. Through the procedures of visiting, the visitor as a subject figure reconstruct yet another poetic constitution out of the work. Owing to this poetic mode of signification, the visitorable works of art always operate on a plane beyond the artist's level of intentionality. Their forms give the visitor access to the significant intention underlying them as a whole. The recreations of works through the subjective procedures of being visited renders meaning constructible rather than transmittable. The visitor has only one fidelity, and that is not to artist's level of intentionality, but to the work's contingent mode of signification. Ultimately, for these reconstructions of meaning to happen, what is required besides the visitorability of the work is the arrival of the subject figure for whom to visit means to practice the art of translation through encountering the contingencies of signs, the arrival of the visitor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm now just presenting Mohammad Salemy, who's also gonna talk about the exhibition. And also I want to give everyone in attendance a reminder that at the end of Mohammad's talk, we're gonna be heading into like a little bit of a discussion between all the presenters, and then we are going to do a Q&A. So whenever you have a question that you'd like to post to our presenters, feel free to use the Q&A box right on below your Zoom window. So without further ado, Mohammad is an independent Berlin-based artist, critic, and curator from Canada. He holds a BFA from Emily Carr University and an MA in Critical Curatorial Studies from the University of British Columbia. He has shown his work in Ashkal Alwan's home work 7 in Beirut in 2015, with Tumen in Rotterdam in 2015, and Robert Love, and I'm not going to do a good job at saying this, in Hoven, maybe, in 2018. His writings have been published in Eflex, Flash Art, Third Rail Brooklyn Raid, Occulta, Arts of the Working Class, and Spike. Salemy's curatorial experiment for machine use only was included in the 11th edition of, maybe Mohammed, would you like to help me there, of the Biennale?
Gwangju Biennale.
Gwangju Biennale, thank you, in 2016. Together with a changing cast, he performs the Artist Collective Alphabet Collection. Salemy is the organizer at the New Center for Research and Practice. He has been co-founding organizer of the New Center since 2014. So Mohammed, please join us today.
Yeah, with a thank you to the Alibaba Conundrum, Babak Golkar and Ali Ahadi, my colleagues and friends, for their invitation, and also lovely Zainab for that great keynote. I'll just jump in and maybe we chit chat afterwards. So I don't have a title for my presentation, but I'm glad to hear that it will be included in the publication, because I think maybe it is, if you guys like it, maybe it's worth it. It needs maybe a little bit of extra bit added to it in order to sort of like define this connection I see with the emerging, with what you have accomplished here, and the significance of the emerging sort of ChatGPT AI. But I think I hint at it at the very end, and then maybe if there's time, I can maybe work on that ending a little bit more. So in terms of its form, Alibaba Conundrum's intervention at Griffin Projects can be placed at the latest stage of a trajectory initiated by Stan Van Der Beek's 1965 movie Drone, which was also theorized later by Gene Youngblood's concept of expanded cinema. I find it analogous to how Marx's critical political economy can be placed right at the end of, or right at the stage where he arrived of political economy. Let me just close this window. It's really funny because like my dog likes to like snore. If it's too much, let me just like put him in the other room, because it was in the other room, but then it just came out. Maybe just give me 1 second, because it's really like distracts myself. I don't know about you guys. Just give me 1 second here. I'm really sorry about this.
No worries, sounds good.
Okay, now I can't. Okay, so it seems like I can't close my camera. Just 1 sec.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, are you able to turn on your video again?
Yes. Just give me 1 sec. So for some reason, I have a little bit of like a issue now with the Zoom, because a participant has enabled closed captioning. When the closed captioning was enabled, my video kind of went missing. So let me just close it and I'll click. They can come back. Just give me 1 sec.
Okay.
Really sorry about this.
No worries. And thank you everyone who's joining us for the patience. We'll have Mohammed back shortly. While that happens, I guess I'll just make another reminder. If you have any questions, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box. I'll be happy to read all your inquiries, and as well for our presenters today. If you have already any questions or any notes that you'd like to bring forward for your section, this might be a little time to think about that. Okay, let's give it another minute. And if not, then maybe we'll just shift the order of events, still leaving the Q&A at the end, but maybe we can do a little bit of talking between the panelists.
Well, he just said that he had to install an update on the Zoom, so he'll be with us shortly.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. Hi there.
Sorry
ahead.
about that. So basically, my
worries.
computer completely crashed and it doesn't open. I'm using the phone, and I'm just gonna make sure that my phone is plugged in so it doesn't run out of battery in the middle of presentation. So just like one more second, and I will set my camera the other way so it matches your screen format. I think it's better, right? So
I think you are sideways. So yeah.
just give me. Yeah, okay, you know what? We're just gonna have to have it like that, I guess.
Yes.
I hope it's all right.
Mhm.
You know, every technological problem is happening right now. So it's always
Unraveling.
like, it's like, Jesus Christ. Okay, so. Yeah, so basically, I think Alibaba Conundrum's intervention can be placed at the latest stage of a trajectory initiated by Stan Van der Beek's 1965 movie Drone, and also theorized later by Gene Youngblood's concept of expanded cinema, which I find it similar to Marxist critical political economy that can be placed at the end of political economy. So in a way, even though you can call this the latest stage of expanded cinema, you could also argue that sort of like this practice kind of like ends expanded cinema and it starts something which I would like to coin as new expanded cinema. So now we're going to get into that and like hear my argument. So just like what Marx was doing, which was an inventive arrangement that spoke through the language of the discourses it sought to criticize until it pulverized them theoretically. So of course, with this formal similarity, it's just a preamble of my exploration. By the end of this presentation, I want to substantiate that this is more than a simply formal resemblance, and that Alibaba Conundrum's original critical linkage of Christian theology, neoliberalism, and global contemporary art, the mediascape, and the hegemony of the English language in these fields is extremely relevant to understanding how all of these issues relate to one another in our current predicament. The wager of expanded cinema, starting from the 1960s, you can still see me, signals the breakdown of cinema's orthodoxies about the viewer that was intrinsic to the project of modernism, both in its avant-garde high culture guise and in its popular iterations. Cinema was a medium of modernity insofar as it colonized the entirety of modern cultural landscape and increasingly imposed its cinematic quality on movies, not only on movies where it began, but on poetry, and backward onto photography and painting, and of course forward into our memory and the way we think about our daily experience and how we remember and memorialize what we have experienced in the past. Still, the cinema's destiny to become postmodern was both propelling and prescient to notice the spatialization of culture as such. It is precisely in the context of this spatialization that expanded cinema emerges in the 60s. Van der Beek's movie drone, for example, was first imagined as a communication system linked to other different drones spread throughout the world and connected by satellites that would receive and transmit images from various sites. At its time, Such an experiment speculated about what the ubiquitous specialization of video could do as a response to the already changing industrial societies where people were familiar with this new system. In that same vein, we can find an argument by Gene Youngblood doing the same kind of like thing to the practice of expanded cinema. By elevating video to the same level as other art forms, assessing the usage of computers in art making, and analyzing a future trend pointing to its more pervasive presence in our everyday life, the exploration of a mass medium such as television in providing something more than mere entertainment as a way of working through mass culture and not merely in its resigned observation. A double movement is involved in revisiting any of these traditions. While living in the present, as we do now, is enough to dissuade us of any hope that the ubiquity of video by default can have any emancipatory impact, we can reconnect with the revolutionary impetus of these new forms of mediation, which is easy to forget while looking at our current commodified social media landscape. It is also worth praising the fact that Alibaba Conundrum can locate itself within the vast tradition of photography and video work in Vancouver, and its incorporation of cinema, video, and photography, and all these kind of media forms. Among many important influences, both within and beyond expanded cinema, we can cite, for example, not just Zainab, but also people like Stan Douglas, Rodney Graham, and Judy Radul, whose work has kind of like established the kind of understanding of this medium in Vancouver and created a kind of possibility for the reception of Alibaba Conundrum's work. However, the work neither dwells nor capitalizes on this context, but skillfully uses them as a line of flight to speak to Vancouver in ways that the city might better understand the more contemporary and planetary themes that the art audience might not quickly recognize and problematize directly in the first place. Wasn't it for this connection? Already, it is precisely the way these antecedents are dealt with that makes it necessary that we call, as I have done since 2016, Alibaba Conundrums part of what I've been terming new expanded cinema, a continuation of expanded cinema's form of inquiry that sketches a new response to the contemporary domination of time-based media on various forms of screens, including projections, and also phones, and also computer screens. Much in the same way that Marx itself theorizes the economy through the new diagrams that modernize the world and emerge during the Industrial Revolution. Placed in response to these, the increasing specialization of video deals with the flat, immaterial reality of post-internet time-based photography, visual time-based art, and projection. In order to escape the shortcomings of these forms and update the impetus of intervening upon the current mediascape, Alibaba Conundrum's film remains as the main component, but a flattened version placed in a linear order. Therefore, the previously time-based nature of film as a medium is creatively bypassed. By how significant elements from within the film are set free from the time constraint of film and placed in different corners of the gallery for the contemplation of the viewers, challenging the tyranny of the linearity of the film. And the audience this way gets to see these elements and abide their own time with it, rather than the cinematic time that's enforced by the 24 frames per second. One of the most interesting fragments featured in the main work, titled 10 plus minus 5 commandments, is the Mel Brooks film, which is then rehashed through derivative fragments installed through the venue coming from the movie History of the World, right? Part 1. Let's just get into this part because I'm making an argument that kind of like revolves around that. Moses, as if peeking in a dirty little secret, carries 3 tablets, which has the 15 commandments on it, right? With God's commandment, and announcing that he has received 15 of them from God. However, right after declaring that he has them, he accidentally drops one on the floor. After realizing his mistake, he quickly recalculates his discourse and reframes his phrase by claiming that he has finally received the 10 commandments from God. This small fragment can be disambiguated into three main elements: God himself, who writes and sends, the presupposed audience, and Moses, which we secretly know will receive a rather biased picture of this. The audience who will receive a biased picture of this commandment, and Moses, who knows that 5 of them are missing. And this prophet, who is chosen by God and must become the medium of transmitting the commandments. In becoming a medium and failing to become perfect, a failure that we all know too well, this initial moment is already tainted with the misunderstanding typical of language. But this is not all. In fact, this small fragment presents us with the capacity of language to create hyperstition, which means semi-truths, untruths inserted into a fabric of truth in ways that it would graft itself to truth and sucks the energy out of the truth and becomes real through this operation. So that's really like the definition of hyperstition, and how this hyperstition shaped the future of discourse in language, and as we see, probably even AI and technology, and how this operation works through the speculative usage of whatever technology here we're dealing with language is at hand. Of course, Moses can only become the prophet precisely if he covers up for his fallibility as a medium of God and project the commandments as being always 10 and not 15. Likewise, Alibaba Conundrum expanded cinema become new expanded cinema by reassembling the pieces from which it is made and contextualizing them into a mediascape where the ubiquity of video is not something alien and speculative, but a suffocating starting point. English language and its deployments here serve as the main medium through which they're implemented in the world in a succession of colonial British rule, and then through dollar imperialism by the United States of America, which led us from the cultural industry to the world of image and moving image-based platforms such as television, YouTube, TikTok, streaming services, Instagram, and so on and so forth. Thus, they allow us to formulate many questions. What to do after the complete spatialization of film in many instances? What does that spatialization tell us about the current state of language? Now that the grounds on which expanded cinema was built seem pulverized by the large disorientation we face through the ubiquity of video, the tripod with which Alibaba Conundrum works, the tripod of Christianity, neoliberalism, and global contemporary art, can only be seen as discourses that attempted to erase their own fallible and damaged origins. However, if there has not been a shortage of critique, why do they endure? And they being the tripod. The explanation for this can only be found in how each of the three pillars show us an iteration of masterly that disavows itself of its own mastery, attempting to create mastery without violence. Be it Christian theology's watering down of its own belief system, the neoliberal fake obsession with the individual, or the focus that contemporary art has placed in repairing its own wrongs by a politicization that only makes sense as another proxy infrastructure set on acting on behalf of spreading the goals and objectives of the American empire. Finally, in such a work that problematizes the structure of language so deeply, we cannot leave the most recent iteration of large language models, ChatGPT, without a brief mention. I have recently experimented with this technology, and if you ask the same questions about, say, gay rights or transgender rights from the platform in Farsi, English, or Turkish, you will get answers that will reproduce the algorithmic unconsciousness of that particular language and no universal value system. Now, this, from one hand, might make us think of the limits of this technology, of how, as Chomsky was talking about it in the New York Times a month ago, that it basically, the lack of understanding in AI system is this lack of making sense of the context and having the kind of like universal understanding of the world that humans, even like as a child, you can have a small image of the entire world, and then sentences and iterations and statements somehow fit or connect to this understanding of the world. And then Chomsky's argument is that basically ChatGPT misses that small or medium or large understanding of the world, and it just makes up things as it goes. But if we accept that, and I think this is one of the points of this one of the exhibition, is that language has always acted that way. What the scary part of ChatGPT is that we may no longer need to worry about domination of English language. What we might have to start worrying about is basically the automation of the domineering automation of all languages using AI. So there will be no escape to another language from English, because slowly, as the large language model expands and as these AI systems develop further, the very same problems that we're trying to address in English will rear their head in other languages. And if you don't believe me, try to interact with ChatGPT using your own language, whichever it is. As long as there's been some documentation of that language online, I think it's very easy for ChatGPT to kind of like figure out the logic of the language, the syntax and the vocabulary, and begin talking to you in an authoritative way, far more authoritative than anything you've seen in any other form of media. Now, how can we read that when we consider this quote by Alibaba Conundrum? I really found this quote kind of like interesting in relation to ChatGPT, which is, in the contemporary world, one is either marked and affected by responding to the speaking of English, or is equally left unmarked and still affected by the inability to voice that speaking. With the omnipresence of English, every peripheral language attempting to connect to the world becomes a torsion of English. This part is actually materially taking place via the AI, and it's no longer a psychological or inner operation that happens at the level of subject or sort of like collective, but it's actually physically, materially is being executed by the machine. Therefore, one is either an English-speaking thinking subject or is simply defined as a negation of it. In other words, every English-speaking subject is also a non-English-speaking subject, and every non-English-speaking subject is definitely an English-speaking subject. The problem is the extremely unequal struggle for recognition between the two, the asymmetrical proportion of this dialectic. It is within this context that Alibaba Conundrum is a performer of the negation of the negation. And my fear is that as these machines become perfect, it's become increasingly hard to perform this negation of negation, unless we want to add another level of negation on top of that, an operation for which we really have no blueprint yet. Through ChatGPT, we finally have the clearest example of the type of provincialism forced on all of us, in which culture is formalized and hard-coded into large language models through probability, but a kind of probability that comes out of the usage of language and the usage of discourse within that language group. Okay, I'm just like lost a little bit. Just give me one sec. Against that, the exercise of Alibaba Conundrum of breaking video down and rebuilding it in space is akin to a kind of a speculative insight that maybe this operation is something that we need to kind of do to language in order to take away the agency from AI. Now, as I said, I'm just beginning to think through this problem by looking at the film and by looking at what that the Artist Collective has done. So you can probably poke holes in my theory, but I really think that the making sense of the the temporality of the making sense of the language itself needs to be broken down, and language needs to be treated how the film is treated in the exhibition for us to be able to take away some of this agency that the AI is providing to itself. So maybe that's really the point that I was trying to make. And the work is successful insofar as it enacts the urge to rethinking social organization beyond alienation. So basically, by kind of reversing the alienation and passing the alienation onto the artwork and giving back the power to move from one concept in a film to another and contemplate according to their own time. So basically, what is alienated in the art in the exhibition space is the film itself. So the process of breaking this film down and dividing it up, it's a kind of strategy that sort of like passes the alienation to the artwork rather than to the subject. So this, as Ray Brassier has claimed, is a de-estrangement as estrangement. So it reverses the estrangement and back to the film to pierce through the dialectics between compulsion and freedom that we reproduce in language and economy alike, and also in viewing art or film. So there's also another link here which I really like to explore, which is the new emerging AI, which basically takes the prompt and makes videos and animations. And I think it will be interesting if I spend a little bit of time to think about how this service is not available yet. The one that you create a prompt and an image is produced, there's already 2 or 3 services. People have probably used it, Midjourney, DAL, and all that. But these video services are about to be unveiled by Facebook is working on one, and other systems are working on similar stuff where you can basically give the plot and the AI creates the film for you. And I think it will be interesting to kind of like see if there's any relation between the installation and the softwares, but I really have to wait for them to become available to try my hand. Yeah, so basically, congratulations to this great work. And I'm really impressed at how well you've placed your practice where it really matters right now. I think this, what's happening with AI, I think is the most important. So it's like a newest level of cybernetic revolution, newest stage of it. And really, I have not seen many artists, consciously or unconsciously, whose work can be somehow linked and kind of like put in dialogue with this really incredible and almost scary development. So yeah, great work, guys. Sorry about my presentation through the phone, but that's all we could do at this as a moment. Sorry about that.
All good. I'm gonna add everyone, the presenters, so that we can continue with our discussion of today's presentation. So if any of you have a question for one another, please post it, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. And as we are chatting, if people in the audience feel like you want the presenters to elaborate on some of the topics that they have discussed, feel free to use the Q&A panel box, and then I'll get back to you. And yes, please take it away.
I just wanted to tell Zainab how excited I was to see the the imaginary institution of society as one of your references, because I spent a lot of time with that book, and I think it's a great critique of basically orthodox Marxism. It's one of the earliest ones, right? And as I'm sure people here are aware, Cornelius Castoriadis was a main figure for the letterist movement from which the Situationist International emerged. So there's a link between ways in which he configures the role of knowledge production, society, and how people like Debord kind of like took it and did crazier stuff with it. But there's one amazing quote in the first chapter or introduction of the book, which I think would be good to bring it up, because I think this is really something that the artists here have acted upon, right? And it's about alienation, right? And basically, I think if I remember, I can pull it up from my Facebook because I posted this quote many times on Facebook, right? And basically, the argument he's making is that if capitalism was successful in completely putting everyone in a bind, it would collapse immediately. So capitalism, as much as it depends on bringing people into the system, it actually thrives on us negating the system and wanting to get out of it, because our creativity to challenge capitalism brings new blood to capitalism and allows it to learn from its mistakes and continue on, right? And I think this, not only like successful art really is about kind of like putting, like how I was saying earlier, it's about sort of like making use of this resistance to capitalism, reverse it, and try to put that in the service of resistance rather than in the service of capitalism. So really, art is one of those areas in which rejection of capitalism can benefit the critique of capitalism and not capitalism itself. And I think works like this, I think, are a perfect example of how, to the operation that I discussed in relation to time-based media, in relation to how much time we are under the tyranny of the temporality of the medium that is in front of us, really kind of like utilizes the white cube, does a world making in it, and basically allows this operation to reverse itself. I don't know if you're familiar with that aspect of Cornelius's work. If you want to just speak a little bit about Cornelius Kotsaradis, it would be great, because I think not many people read this book. It's a very, very important book, and I think it's great that you brought it to your presentation.
Well, thanks for your presentation. First of all, and I would say, yeah, alienation is a key analytic in this. And I'll come back to Cornelius, to address that maybe later on. But I also just want to say that I thought, Mo, your negation of negation was brilliant. I really liked that. And also the way that you kind of frame the new expanded cinema and the conditions of reception, of the video of like the commandments, right? The 10 plus minus 5 commandments. But I also just want to say to Ali's and Babak's situating and problematizing the idea of the visitor as a linguistic device, and thus sort of, invoking, I guess, the politics of language and its relationship to reality and its epistemology. I mean, I thought these were really, really interesting parts in the presentations that we heard. Ali and Babak, I'm sure you want to jump in here and say a few words.
Well, I would love to. Let me first thank you both for this fantastic contributions. I really mean it, and was really thought-provoking. I really enjoyed, Zainab, your question of like the epistemic injustice as a crisis of language. That really makes me think of, because it's really interesting and linked, as you said. You treat this epistemic injustice as a crisis of language, which we also see that crisis of language as the result of a very juridical, ontological situation of the neoliberal world. So it is an ontological logic or transcendental, allowing this language being critical and having this crisis and never letting a good crisis go to the waste, as capitalism never does that. And at the same time, Mo's idea of basically this marvelous reading of Moses, the metaphor of Mel Brooks, like screwing one of the tablets as the inherent significant problem of language, and this deconstructions of language into spatial temporal, forms that we did in Alibaba Conundrum after the video, that also really links back to this notion of the visitor, constantly linguistically intervening and deconstructing the language into fragments to reconstruct this poetic, or as Mo quoted Ray Brassier, de-estranging estrangement itself as estranging. I really enjoyed this whole dynamic relationships between all your presentations. So thank you so
Ali,
much.
you guys' paper was fantastic. I really need to read it. It was just so incredible. I mean, I'm sure you can expand it because you guys are just going at it. You know what I mean? You're just like shooting what like these I hate to say like problems or enemies, like one after another, but like the way you line them up, it's fascinating. I mean, I've hardly heard anyone put these together in such a constellation. So it'll be great if you share these papers and read them and maybe comment on them or something before the publication wants to go somewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that would be great if you are able to share anything.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll circle back. Are there any questions?
About the exhibition, I just wanted to say, you know what I mean? Like the alienation of the film in that room is just fantastic because like you basically broke it, you know what I mean? Like I've seen this type of like new expanded cinema. I worked with an artist in 2016 in Lisbon, very great Portuguese artist. I don't want to bring name and confuse you guys with more artists and people, but his name is Hugo Canoilas. He did this he remade Under the Volcano, another Vancouver connection, right? But the way he kind of like pulled elements out was very faithful to the structure of cinema, was very faithful to how film is made. But it didn't sound like that he would just smash that film or that book on the ground and just throw it around like what you guys have done. His way of expanding the film was very systematic. It was like, okay, this is the dialogue. This is all the like important action in the film. This is the soundtrack. This is all these elements that normally, like in a technical filmmaking, we put together to make the film. Basically, they separated those. But what you've done here is it's alienating, but not alienating to the audience. I think it's alienating to what's going on in the film because there's this way that you've dispersed these pieces around the gallery that is very like I've never seen it. It's very like unique, and I think this project has leg to be shown elsewhere, and we should try to bring it to Europe or do something with it somewhere because I think what you accomplished here is like really needs to get out of Vancouver.
We agree. We've been discussing this and kind of planning ahead, and we do think Europe is a sort of a fertile ground for it. Britain in particular, we feel like it needs to be shown in Britain, as the language is kind of related to the, you know, it's kind of mother land, and we are in talks with certain institutions. The kind of tightrope that we've been walking is, you know, the nature of institution is, as you said, kind of to embed critique and normalize and take it in as part of their own discourse. We want to resist that, essentially. So it's got to be very interesting, but also there are other medium or media that we are starting to think about and bring into conversation as forms of presentation. Yeah.
And also, I cannot let this go without mentioning this as well. Your remarks on ChatGPT, that I hate talking about works in our own talks and like referring back to the works, but it's funny that like we think that like to become a visitor is a position that both the artists and the viewer can achieve to become. So we can always revisit what we've done ourselves afterwards. And now I'm doing it, and there's this jokish moment in the film that Moses, and there is this verse from the book of Exodus that the God appeared to him in form of flames of the bush, And so we have one bush, which is where the God appears to Moses. And then we have this, the Bush Chapel, which is this very specific location in the St. Catherine Monastery. And then we have the Bush Building in London, which is basically the oldest neoliberal or liberal shopping mall, later on becoming the head office of BBC. So these are really similar to these mistakes that the ChatGPT could make, like between the very signifier Bush from this one jumping to another and deconstructing itself. So when Mo was talking about these errors and basically taking away, alienating ChatGPT against itself, I really enjoyed hearing that. Thanks, Mo.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's interesting. Why is Mo gone? Oh,
I'm here. I just closed my camera because my signal is a little bit low. It was choppy, but I'm here.
Okay, well, I'm waiting for questions in the Q&A panel, but I just want to make sure that you got all of the exchange that you wanted out of this little conversation. And maybe Ali Babak, can you tell us a little bit more about where's the exhibition or your work will be going? Like, where is it developing towards?
We are in discussions with a couple of institutions in Canada, but also in Europe, as I mentioned. We do feel like it needs to be traveled, but also online presence is becoming more important at the moment, like more immediate, not more important, but more immediate, and it's going to be prioritized soon. Publication is, as you're aware, is in the works. Collaborations with other institutions, which is an extension of working with you guys, as well as new body of work coming out of the film. Because the film, it's quite long. It's got so many elements that we have essentially notebooks filled with objects and ideas, but we would respond to spaces according to those contexts and according to our notes to recreate or to create new ones. But we feel like context is very important in that sense. So we would be working towards that. I'm sorry I can't give you any specific answers at the moment, as they're being negotiated.
Ongoing conversations, and but it's great to hear that there's different iterations, and like knowing your work with site specificity and knowing that you're looking to collaborate and think about the context in which your art exists. I can only see how successful you'll be in the future. I'm very excited for that. And
involving, we've really enjoyed involving each other in the project. And we feel like it needs to be expanded. And also, we've really enjoyed working with Zainab and Mohammed. So this is really encouraging to expand it further.
Just to add one quick thing to what Babak said, because what took place today in this panel with the keynote of Zainab and Mo's talk, it really makes us, because we truly did our best to treat Alibaba Conundrum as a project that holds fast, even religiously, to this idea that there has to be discursive argumentations. And this discursive argumentation could only take place on the occasion of art. So the art is, instead of the art being talked about that, oh yeah, in this work we did that, you know what I'm saying? So there is this great chance and occasion to argue about whatever we'd like to argue, as like Zainab's paper was basically the scope of the paper and the interlocutor or the receptors of those papers are way more broader than this very specific exhibition. But how could that take place without two people having done something, creating the situation? So this discursive part that is taking place today for us is the extension of the work. This is not discourse talking about art. This is discursive argumentation itself as a form of art practice. And to us, I think this is really quite important, that we don't treat this as interpretations of the artistic. This is literally a form of practice with its materiality being language.
I want to just jump in for a minute. I wonder if you've considered doing a series like Adam Curtis's An Emotional History of the World, because that was really fantastic. And I wonder if you could have thought of doing something like that, because it was so powerful and really unfolds, with each chapter.
That's really tempting to think about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we would definitely think about it.
Yeah.
And
We're an avid watcher of Adam Curtis, so I think it would be right up our alley.
Yeah, like an assemblage of videos. I think it would be amazing.
Okay, and maybe to wrap this conversation up, I'm just going to ask a question that was posed by Griffin Art Projects director Lisa Baldissera. You folks can see it in the chat box, panelist, and I'll just gonna ask it out loud for captioning purposes. So Lisa says, thank you all for these dynamic presentations. I am very interested in the intersection of these three concepts in your talks. In Zainub's, thinking through homeostatic feeling as the source of consciousness. In Ali and Babak's commentary on the body as always as a composite being. And Mohammad's concern with the condition of ChatGPT as a mediating and summarizing source of language. So if you folks want to maybe berate around this comment, that would be great.
You want to?
I think, it makes perfect sense to. I read it mostly as a comment than a question. And as we previously also talked about this linkage between these different keystones in each presentation, and it's really interesting because we hadn't. There was this body of work as Alibaba Conundrums project, and every individual contributor here, they did their own work, but how organically they're related together. That to us, it sounds like that the ontological world in which Alibaba Conundrums could take place as a project, apparently it's taking the place rightly so, because the questions that Zainab raised, this question of epistemic injustice, it's highly crucially significant. Specifically, anytime the word epistemic comes up, since it has to do with cognitive faculty or cognition, as though it is an individual problem that there is an epistemic situation. Whereas the epistemic injustice is always, although it is epistemological, it's always linked to an ontological framework. Without a transcendental, logical, state-related, economically driven situation, there cannot be an epistemic crisis. And at the same time, the way Mo links this to the question of that this has always been embedded in the problem of language itself as a technology, the invention of which being a technology, and our approach to the question of visitor and body being a composite object, as Lisa said. This question of body being a composite object is really an anti-neoliberal statement, because the body that is, we're basically having this ecstasy and the overdosage of the word, the body, the sex, identity, and so on and so forth. But this body has a language. This body has a geopolitics. This body has a racial status, itself being a geopolitical issue, rather than being an identitarian aspect. So therefore, a body can never, ever be an individual entity. It's always composites, be it a body of artwork, which is an installation, formalizing a problem set, or being a body of a contemporary problem, which one might call it financial late capitalism, and so on and so forth. So this is a body, and this body is highly in contrast with identitarian approach to the question of body, which is always about the self, the desire, and the expressions of the self in an extreme fashion, because we believe that the desire that the individual is trained to feel that it's coming from their inside It's literally a form of subjectivity being installed from the outside through the epistemic crisis that Zainab is talking about, through the language crisis that Mo is talking about. So I think it's related. I hope that I have commented on that comment. But yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to add something to Lisa's question, if I'm saying the name right. Yeah, Lisa, right? Yeah, so, you know, just to maybe, I hate to say correct, but like, I really want to point out that like ChatGPT outputs in perfect language, but what ChatGPT does is automation of things. It's, hello?
Go ahead.
Yeah, we can hear you, Mohammed.
Yeah, it's really about mechanizing the process of human thinking and then outsourcing it to the machine, right? So it does very basic rudimentary thinking, but with a very high level language output of those very simple thoughts, right? But really what's at stake here is thinking within language. And then it does thinking within each language in a different way because it mimics the processes of human thinking out of the syntax and the sort of like language ingredients, right? It basically goes over the ingredients and then it does its best job of thinking. It's really what at stake here is the process of thinking, not just language. Language is just the output of, becomes like the output of this process, which is here, I can do the thinking for you. I can do the like low level or medium level thinking for you, you know, whatever it is. If it's about thinking about writing an email, I can just do it for you. If it's about even like, I mean, I'm fascinated by it and I'm writing stuff about it and I'm writing with it and I'm writing against it, right? And it really understands some basic concepts of logic, which is like very basic logic of language. Like I give you an example. I was chatting with it in Farsi, not in English, right? Because I try to do as much Farsi with it rather than speaking English because I want to challenge it because I think it's easier to find out its fault lines in languages with less of a sort of like database than with English, which is basically has mastered, right? And I asked it, I said, what do you think about drugs? And then it said, drugs are really bad. Drugs are really bad for you and all that. And I said, I'm from Canada. And in my country, the government actually sells marijuana and is in the process of legalizing mushrooms. The answer it gave me really blew me away. It said, do not conflate endorsement of drugs with the policy measures of Canadian government to fight crime or decrease crime and think about healthcare costs in long term. You're conflating these two. Just the fact that Canadian government has legalized marijuana doesn't mean it endorses it, but it has done so in order to reduce harm. So it could totally catch the flaw in my logic of my sentence, right? Because I tried to tell it that like, hey, you're telling me drugs are bad, but Canada is endorsing it. It was like Canada's not endorsing it. Canada's fighting crimes, and Canada's trying to reduce some other thing that in no way should be seen as endorsing of it. So you see here what at stake here is like the ability of the system to kind of like understand the basic logic through the medium of language and then use it to hyperstitionalize a very authoritative voice of God that's coming from above to you, right? So I think this is sort of like what I'm kind of figuring out with it.
So I'll just jump in from Lisa's initial comment. I mean, basically what I'm talking about is how the hierarchy of, Descartes, I think, therefore I am, the rationality versus feeling, and that we really need to bring that. We need to be looking at the other side of this. But there's something that's really interesting also that's happening that I'm sort of looking into. And it's coming from a Portuguese theorist that there is an epistemicide. So the suicide of episteme is going on. And I think that's something that's fascinating to me, and I'm looking further into it. So, I think this should be the first of conversations, not the only conversation that we're going to have, because clearly, you know, there's so much depth in all of this, and we really need to actually maybe have another forum to kind of unpack at another level, which is well beyond today's, you know, panel.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for everyone for these closing thoughts. It's been an honor to hear your presentations and to hear you in conversation. I'm sure future iterations of this project will bring in new conversations and new points to chat through. And thank you everyone for joining us here today for the Alibaba Conundrum Keynote and panel discussion. If you are in Vancouver, we hope to see you tomorrow for our last public program of the cycle with artists Miriam Berndt and Phoebe Bay in their open studio. To check out this event, you can go to the link that I'm posting on the chat now. I'm also including the newsletter just to remind everyone that we still have Alibaba Conundrum in exhibition. We're open Friday through Sunday, noon to 5 p.m. if you want to come and check out the show. And if you want to know about Griffin Art Projects, public programs, residence opportunities, and whatnot, you can sign up to our newsletter, which I also included in the links that I just shared with you. And I'll just pass it to you for last words. But thank you so much, Ali, Babak, Mohammad, and Dr. Verjee.
Yes, thanks. And thank you, Ali, and thank you, Babak. And it was really nice to hang out with Zainab. It's so hard to talk to Zainab. She's so busy all the time. So
Thanks,
it was
everyone.
Thank you, Mo.
Thank you, Mo. Thanks. That was great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Zainab.
Thanks, Zainab.
Thank you.
Thank
Fawn.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.